Okay, thank you everybody for joining us today. We are going to talk about SCRIE and DRIE. And as you will get much more information, SCRIE is Senior Citizen Rent Increase Exemption, and DRIE is Disability Rent Increase Exemption, and these are basically ways of freezing one's rent based on certain eligibility criteria. So without further ado, I'm Stephanie Taylor and I'm with Lori Roseman. And just a bit about our organization, Volunteers of Legal Service. We were founded almost 40 years ago in 1984 to close the access to justice gap. And we work a lot with community organizations, law firms, and corporations. We train and mentor pro bono attorneys from law firms and corporations in order to connect them with communities and community-based organizations. We have 6 different projects. We have the senior law project with a focus on veterans, that does a lot of end-of-life planning. We have an immigration project that works with immigrant youth and their families in accessing immigration remedies. We have our benefits law project, which we'll get into a bit more in the next slide. We have our children's project that does a variety of different types of legal work, including housing and immigration. We have our micro enterprise project where we help small businesses establish corporate structure and deal with commercial leasing. A lot of those businesses are run by immigrant or BIPOC folks. And then we have our incarcerated mothers law project. I also supervise this project, and we work with incarcerated mothers in Seconic, Bedford Hills correctional facilities, as well as Rikers Island. And we work on family law issues with those cases. And just a bit about our project, which is why we're here, our benefits law project. We assist clients with unemployment insurance, SCRIE and DRIE, which we'll get into, and then also SSI and SSD, disability applications. And as you all probably know, there are so many public benefits, federal, state, and more local, that New Yorkers might be eligible for. So our services are designed to help clients understand what they're eligible for and how to apply for those benefits. And as I've already mentioned, we work with firms, corporations, and CBOs. So today's agenda, we're going to talk about what SCRIE and DRIE are, go over eligibility for both, talk about how to apply, since this is about applying for SCRIE and DRIE, talk about when to apply, and then review what a SCRIE and DRIE application looks like. And then after this presentation, we're going to sort of get into what to expect at legal clinics. Okay, I'm going to pass it over to Tori to take it from here. Thank you, Tori.
Stephanie. So just to give a little bit of an idea of what is SCRIE, where did this program come from? So the program was created in an effort to help low-income senior citizens, right? You know, city saw an issue where you had senior citizens living in their homes for long periods of time, and now having a difficulty maintaining their rent obligations. So SCRIE was created, and then DRIE was created in 2005 after SCRIE as an amendment to the law that created SCRIE. So throughout this presentation, you'll hear us talk about both. Really, our focus is SCRIE, but the two programs are tied together, so it's hard to talk about one without the other. So who does SCRIE help? SCRIE helps eligible senior citizens 62 and older stay in affordable housing by freezing their rent. And we'll talk about what affordable housing is and what freezing their rent means. But that's really the basics of SCRIE, is that it freezes the rent at a certain amount. So tenants continue paying that frozen amount, even if the landlord increases the rent. And then, you know, the benefit for the landlord is that even though they're missing that higher rent amount, the landlord gets a property tax credit that covers the difference between the new and then the original rent amount. So that's SCRIE, and then DRIE is very similar, and it operates in a very similar manner, but rather than being over the age of 62, tenants have to meet the definition of disabled. So you don't have to be over the age of 62. You have to meet the definition of disabled, but otherwise the program programs are substantially similar. So some basic eligibility requirements. So who would be eligible for SCRIE? Like we mentioned, you have to be 62 and older, not 60, not 65, 62. The next is that you live in either a rent regulated, a rent controlled, or a 467C apartment. You know, rent controlled are apartments in buildings with 3 or more units that were completed prior to 1947 and continuously occupied by the same tenant since July 1st of 1971, which is a little different than rent stabilized housing, which would be almost all apartment buildings containing 6 or more dwelling units completed before 1974. And again, we'll talk in a little bit more detail about these housing considerations, but the basic is that client has to live in a certain type of apartment in order to be eligible for SCRIE. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to find out how someone lives in that sort of apartment. The next requirement is that they have a household income of no more than $50,000 a year for the previous year. Keyword there is household income. It's not just the SCRIE applicant, it's everybody in the household. So something to consider if a client or a tenant has more than one person in their household, what their income looks like. And then the last is that they spend more than a third of their monthly household income on rent. And this is somewhere where tenants who apply may have some difficulty if they're not hitting that 1/3 of their monthly household income on rent. But these are the basic eligibility requirements. So then when we're talking about DRIE eligibility, it does require a head of household who either receives SSI, which is supplemental security income, SSDI, which is social security disability insurance, veterans benefits, or disability related Medicaid, amongst other benefits. So that list is not exhaustive, but that is what the DRIE program is looking for. And then similarly, they have to live in that same sort of rent regulated apartment, or they have to live in an apartment that falls under the rent regulated umbrella. Again, similarly, that they have a household income of no more than $50,000 a year for the previous year, and then the spending more than 1/3 of their monthly household income on rent. So again, you can see how the programs are administered very similarly. The only difference is what the head of household, this first prong about whether or not they're disabled or if they're qualified as a senior citizen. So let's talk a little bit more about eligible apartments, right? So like we said, applicants for SCRIE and DRIE must live in and be on the lease, or an eligible apartment per Chapter 52, the rules of the City of New York. So being on the lease is key here, right? And sometimes when we're looking at the lease, we want to make sure that the tenant is on the lease. If they have other household members, whether or not they're on the lease is something to consider. So then again, when we're talking about eligible apartments, we're looking at either rent controlled or rent stabilized apartments. They're eligible for either benefit. And then 467C apartments are also eligible for both benefits. Applications for SCRIE benefits for 467C have to be submitted to HPD, which is a slightly different agency than what we're going to be working with, which is DOF, the Department of Finance. So for 467C apartments, those applications actually go to a different administrator. That agency administers SCRIE program for 467C apartments. We're mostly working with the Department of Finance on rent controlled and rent stabilized apartments. And again, other types of housing are not eligible. So if a tenant lives in a non-rent controlled condo, or if they just live in a regular apartment, if they outright own their property, they're not eligible for those SCRIE or those DRIE benefits. So typically before we speak to the tenant, that is our main focus, is making sure that where they live is an eligible building. So how do we identify those types of apartments, right? How do we know? Because there's a few different types of apartments here. So a rent-controlled apartment actually does not have a lease. Tenants may sign something like initially, but again, part of a rent-controlled building is that they were occupied by the same tenant since July 1st of 1971. But a rent-controlled apartment doesn't utilize a lease. the tenants are permanent residents of that apartment. So instead, rent is determined by what's called the maximum base rent system, which is calculated every 2 years by a different agency. So what you're looking for from a tenant is they're going to get a notice about their maximum base rent. So they're not going to produce a lease for you. They would produce a totally different document about the maximum base rent that does come from their landlord or their building management. However, then you have a rent stabilized apartment. They do utilize leases. And then depending on the building, those leases could be renewed every year or every other year. So every 1 or every 2 years. The New York City Rent Guidelines Board sets the allowable rent increases for rent stabilized apartments, right? Because again, these are a specific set of apartments in an effort to like mitigate the cost of living, right? So we don't want to see very large increases in rent. So the Rent Guidelines Board sets parameters on how much the rent could be increased year to year. But in a rent stabilized apartment, an easy way to determine if it's rent controlled or rent stabilized is rent stabilized has a lease, rent control doesn't. And then 467C apartments are apartments owned by either certain housing companies or sublessees of the Battery Park Housing Authority that has senior or disabled tenants. So again, those applications for SCRIE benefits have to be submitted to HPD, which is that agency that administers those apartments. There are some helpful tools to figure out what sort of apartment there are. There's the ACRIS database. You can go to HPD's online database. They also state whether or not the apartments are rent stabilized. And then there's the Department of Buildings, Building Information System. So again, typically we're trying to identify that factor before, but if you're not sure, there are some other resources to try to figure out where the apartment falls under. So here's an example of a renewal lease, right? So again, if we're talking about a lease, we're probably talking about rent stabilized. So you can see it has like the date that the lease would expire. There's the date that the lease was signed. You can see the tenant's name, which is important. It speaks about the deposit, whether or not it's a 1 or a 2 year lease. So this is just an example of what you would see from a tenant. So let's talk a little bit about income. So again, the rule is that the total income for all household members for the tax year preceding the application. And again, this is preceding the application. So we're talking about 2023, we're looking at 2022, for example. Has to be no more than $50,000 a year. Income is defined sort of broadly, right? There's only limited deductions allowed for federal, state, and city income taxes, and then Social Security taxes. However, income does actually not include certain things like cash gifts or inheritance or Nazi victim reparations, energy assistance payments. So you can see that there's a pattern where if it's like a one-time payment, it's probably not going to impact your income. And then of course, other like minor benefits like SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition and Assistance Program benefits, that also does not count as income. So again, when we're talking about income, we're typically talking about either Social Security benefits, or we're talking about minor income from like a pension. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about income. So that's income, but then let's talk about household members, right? So a roomer, a boarder, a subtenant, someone who is like just renting a certain room is not a household member. So when you think of a household member, you maybe think of a couple, a husband and a wife, or a parent and a child, but that's different than a boarder or a subtenant. So for example, if someone rents a room from the tenant in the apartment, their income is not part of the household income, which is compared to say, again, let's say a senior parent is living with their child. Those are 2 household members and both of their income has to be accounted for. However, if someone has a subtenant, that rent payment that they make to the tenant does count as part of the tenant's income. So let's say I'm a senior citizen and I have an extra room. I am renting out that room for, let's say $500 a month. That $500 a month doesn't count towards like the household income, but it does count as my income, right? So we put an example here, right, that Mary rents a room to Jim, right? Jim pays Mary $1,000 per month for the room. Mary's income between her pension and her Social Security is $30,000 annually. Jim is employed and his annual salary is $52,000, right? So Mary does not need to include Jim's salary as part of her income, but she does have to include his $1,000 monthly rent payments or $12,000 annually as part of her income. So her total income is $42,000, right? Which is part of what she collects annually plus the monthly rent, but she doesn't have to account for Jim's income because he's not a household member. So let's talk a little bit about the SCRIE application itself. So this is what the application looks like. This application is extremely straightforward. Really is not supposed to have any tricky questions on it. The application comes from the DOF, the Department of Finance. The Department of Finance is who administers most SCRIE benefits. So this is what the first page looks like. As you can see, it does give some amount of instruction, right? And it's really just looking for some basic information, tenant's name, how many rooms their apartment has, what sort of income they have, really just basic information. And then this second page has a couple of other considerations. There is tenant representative information. You can, or a tenant can designate a representative, which could be, again, someone who is helping them with the application. It could be a child, just to make sure that someone else is getting the information from SCRIE. And then this bottom part talks about other household members. So like I just talked about, it's important to distinguish between a household member, someone who lives in the household, versus someone who rents or sublets or boards or rooms. People tend to use different terms for it. I think subleasing is the most accurate. So they are not a household member, but the rent that they pay to the tenant will count for income. So you wouldn't put a sublessor in this other household member section, but you would put their income in the income section. And then of course, this is apartment type and certification. So this is where, again, whether or not they have a lease can be helpful. That's where some of those databases can be helpful. If you're not sure, if the tenant is not sure, I will say that most tenants tend to have a sense of what sort of housing they live in, especially between rent stabilized and rent controlled. So they typically know, but again, if you're not sure, there are some resources to figure out what sort of apartment it is. So the Department of Finance wants to know what sort of apartment. They're not looking for so much information, right? They're either looking for the lease, right, and what the lease term is, or they're looking for the notice of increase in maximum benefit rate and the maximum collectible rent form. And then this is one of the last pages. So in the application, the Department of Finance actually lists what documents are required. So this is not actually a huge documentary list compared to other applications. They're looking for proof of age. Of course, the whole benefit is based on being 62 or older. The Department of Finance just needs proof that you are a senior citizen by their definition. Of course, they're looking for proof of income as well, right? Again, income being pretty broadly defined. And they give examples here, right? So the easiest way to prove income is generally federal or state income tax returns. That way, that you're addressing all your income from the same year. However, not everybody maintains those returns. Not everybody files taxes. So there are alternate methods to prove your income, right? Whether that's, you're providing pay stubs for some sort of employment, if you're proving that you receive Social Security benefits, proof of pension payments. So typically taxes are just the easiest mechanism, but the Department of Finance will accept other mechanisms to prove your income. And then there's proof of rent, right? So with rent stabilized, of course, we're looking at the lease. With rent control, we're looking at the notice of increase in maximum base rent. And then with rent regulated / single room occupancy, which again, we don't see nearly as much. They just ask for a slightly different form. You get a Division of Housing and Community Renewal annual apartment registration. So that's just a little bit different. But again, for the most part, we're looking at either a lease or a notice of increase in maximum base rent and maximum collectible rent. And then the last one would be a power of attorney, if applicable. Again, we are talking about seniors. Some of them do have power of attorney documents, but all of this information is here for what a tenant would need to submit in order to be eligible. Now, this is what the application looks like when a tenant has to apply through HPD, which is the Department of Housing Preservation and Development. We will have paper copies available at the clinic if we need them. So again, the form just looks a little bit different because it's going to a different agency who administers the benefits, but it's substantially similar, right? Just looking for some general information like address, name of the head of household, household information, where again, you're listing household members, distinguishing between subtenants and household members, and then supplying them with some income information. So as you can see, that HPD application is much shorter, right? It's pretty straightforward. So just to talk about renewal, we have to talk about renewal if we're talking about SCRIE. So SCRIE is not a benefit that just lasts forever. Tenants have to renew their SCRIE benefit, and it is the applicant's responsibility to keep track of when they have to renew. The Department of Finance and HPD will sometimes send out renewal forms to tenants, especially tenants who are newer to SCRIE or if their SCRIE lapsed, but they have no responsibility to do that, right? So applicants can just resubmit that same form that we just talked about, or just wanted to show you an example of the short form renewal application. So if a tenant's been on SCRIE for more than 5 years, they can use this short form renewal application, right? Because they've already provided the same information to the Department of Finance every year or two, depending on their term. So they can use this shorter form. Again, as you can see, this is only 2 pages compared to the other application, which is more like 4 or 5. It's just a little bit of a faster mechanism if they've already been receiving SCRIE for long enough. Okay, so to talk about the clinic itself, right? So this is an outline of how we anticipate the clinic will go. So of course, the whole point is that we're going in to meet with community members, right? Who are likely to be eligible for either SCRIE or DRIE, more likely SCRIE. So of course, you want to make sure that you're introducing yourself and your role as a volunteer with VOLS. We like to make sure that everybody understands the parameters of this. You know, of course, we're coming in as lawyers. It can be very tempting for people to ask us some additional questions or questions outside of SCRIE and DRIE. So you just want to introduce yourself and make it clear that this is what we're here to talk about today. And then, of course, discussing SCRIE and DRIE questions and considerations, right? If they have questions about SCRIE, if they have questions about the administration of the program, and part of that is going through eligibility, right? To see if that tenant would actually be eligible for SCRIE or DRIE. So discussing eligibility with them. So ideally, you're going to meet with this community member, take in some information, see if they're eligible for those benefits, either of those benefits. And then you're going to open up and fill out the VOLS online intake form. So we have an online intake form. We have some pictures of it that we'll show you very shortly. It is very important to fill out that form. Our understanding is that you should have service in this building. That shouldn't be an issue, but please make sure that you are bringing a laptop so that you can fill out this intake form. It's important that the information populates on our end in case we need to do follow-up. And of course, we do an intake form for any client that we speak with. So it's just really important that we're capturing that information on our end. So after you speak with them, filling out the online intake form, you're then going to see if they're ready to submit that SCRIE or that DRIE application, right? So you'll confirm, right, that they are of the correct age for SCRIE or that they meet the definition of disabled for DRIE, that their income is qualifying and, you know, what you're accounting for in terms of income, that 1/3 of the client's income is spent on rent, right? Making sure that they're spending the right amount to be eligible. And then, of course, residing in an eligible apartment, but likely to already know that by the time you're here. And then reviewing the client's documents, right? So like I mentioned, the application does require documentary proof of some of these considerations. So you just want to make sure that the client has documents. They may not have all of the documents that they need right then and there. But you just want to go through what they do have, see if that's acceptable, see if it, properly explains, for example, their income. So for example, if a client doesn't have their tax returns, but they have pay stubs or other proof of their income, you just want to go through those documents with them and see if that's enough or if that's an accurate depiction of their income. And if you go through the screening, you go through the documents and everything looks good, you just want to make sure that you're reviewing that application, right? Is all the information there? Are you properly accounting for household members or income? Do you have the right documents, or are there things that you might still need? And then is everything filled out, right? Did you fill out all the sections? It's not a crazy long application, but you do just want to double check that you didn't miss anything, and that the tenant has signed it, right? So that is the process that we are looking at.
And I just want to chime in to say that we, VOLS will be there to answer any questions, to review any documents that the clients bring in, to take a look at the application. So this is not, we're not expecting you all to, fill this out without any guidance or assistance or help. So we'll be there available and expecting to, check in with you.
Thanks. I think we can move to the next slide. Okay, so like we said, you do want to make sure that you are introducing yourself, right, and indicate that you're a volunteer through VOLS. I just want to reiterate that, we're coming in, we're attorneys, we work for like a legal corporation, right? So it could be really tempting for these tenants to want to ask us additional questions that are just outside of the scope of our role today. You just want to be clear about what your role is here and what we're doing today. We're there to discuss SCRIE and DRIE. And we do have an initial script in our online intake form if you need help, which again, the online intake form is coming very shortly. Important note on language needs. So some community members are LEP or limited English proficient. That can range, right? So if someone is limited English proficient and they really can't communicate in English, you'll end up working with bilingual advocates and interpreters. Again, LEP is a range, so it's also possible that community members are comfortable in English, but maybe they speak with a heavy accent. It may be that community members don't know that we have interpreters, so they assume they have to speak in English, and we are able to provide them with interpretation services. But if someone requires interpretation services and there's an interpreter present, you just want to make sure that they also have the opportunity to introduce themselves, to explain their role in this process. And then, of course, if you're utilizing an interpreter, just want to make sure that you are giving them the opportunity to hear what you're saying by speaking in short and clear sentences, and then giving them the time and space to intake what you're saying, interpret it for the client in front of you, let the client speak, and then have it interpreted back to you. So you just want to make sure that you're giving them the room and that you're giving them the room to explain to the client that they also need to speak in clear, short sentences. Sometimes clients just get excited, right? Very easy to speak to someone who is an interpreter, but you just want to make sure that you're both speaking in clear, short sentences so that the interpretation is correct. Okay, so here is our online intake form. This is the first page. We'll go through most of it, if not all of it. So as you can see, we just want you to put in your name and your email and your phone number, just an easy way for us to follow up in case there is some sort of issue or we have some follow-up questions about the meeting with the client. So again, this is a good script to start with, right? Especially as you're coming in, someone that they're not familiar with. So you just want to explain like who you are, that you're going to be collecting some demographic information, right? And that you're just going to be asking them some basic questions, that the information that they're sharing is confidential, and that you're asking questions just to understand, right? Just to see if they're eligible for SCRIE in this context. But we're asking questions just to understand what the issue is, right? And see if we could be helpful. So here's more information that we're looking for, the applicant's first and last name, their address. Again, we are talking about housing here, so obtaining some of this information should not be so difficult. And then of course, phone number. Phone number is a great place to put, sometimes again, tenants have a son or daughter, a niece, a nephew, they have someone who helps them, or maybe, if you can't reach the tenant, or if we need to reach the tenant at another time, you can put in a different phone number for someone else who can help them. And then this is really just basic demographic information, right? Their date of birth, which we're going to need to know, especially for screening for SCRIE, gender, race, ethnicity, marital status. A lot of this information is relevant to the application, actually, about whether, sources of income, we're talking about household members, their veteran status, the language that's best for them, whether or not they identify as an immigrant. So all of these are just really basic demographic questions. Now that's really it for now. Does anybody have any questions? I know that this is a lot of information. The last thing that I will add is that, again, for the clinic itself, please bring laptops. Please bring something to fill in the online intake form. We're not sure exactly how many tenants are going to appear at the clinic at this time, but we are likely to pair you up into groups of, I think, 2, Stephanie, so that you can work together.